The unexpected guest. It was a quiet night in the small town of Willow Creek. The streets were empty, and the only sounds were the soft rustling of leaves and the distant howl of the wind. John Miller, a lonely mechanic in his late 30s, sat in his workshop, tinkering with an old radio. He loved working late. It kept his mind off the emptiness of his life. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the silence. It sounded like something heavy crashing outside. John froze, his hand still on the screwdriver. He glanced at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Who's out there at this hour? He muttered to himself. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped out into the chilly night, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The sound had come from the back of his workshop, near the woods. As he approached, his heart raced. He wasn't the type to get scared easily, but something about this night felt different. He heard rustling, then a faint groan. Someone was there. "Hello," John called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" No response. Cautiously, he moved closer, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Behind a stack of wooden crates, he saw a figure huddled on the ground. It was a woman, her clothes torn and strange-looking, almost like they belonged in a sci-fi movie. Her hair was a silvery white, and her skin seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't let them find me." John knelt down, his initial fear replaced by concern. "Are you hurt? What happened?" The woman winced as she tried to sit up. "They're coming. I need to hide." "Who's coming?" John asked, glancing around nervously. He couldn't see anyone, but the urgency in her voice made his skin crawl. Before she could answer, the sound of distant hums echoed through the woods. It didn't sound like anything natural, more like machinery, but nothing John had ever heard before. The woman grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone who looked so fragile. "Please, I can't be out here," she begged, her glowing eyes locking onto his. "They'll find me." John hesitated for only a moment. He didn't understand what was going on, but he couldn't leave her out here. "Come on," he said, helping her to her feet. "Let's get you inside." She leaned on him as they hurried back to the workshop. Once inside, John locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. The woman collapsed onto a chair, breathing heavily. Up close, John could see how strange she truly was. Her skin wasn't just shimmering. It seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. Her clothes were made of a material he couldn't identify, and there were strange glowing symbols on her arms. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Lyra," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for helping me." "Who's after you, Lyra? And what's with those lights in the woods?" John asked, sitting across from her. He wanted answers, but he didn't want to scare her off. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "It's complicated. I can't explain everything right now, but they're dangerous. If they find me, they'll destroy everything." "Destroy everything," John repeated, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" Before she could answer, the sound of the humming grew louder. It was closer now, almost outside. John felt a chill run down his spine. He peeked through the curtains and saw faint blue lights flickering in the distance. "They're here," Lyra said, her voice trembling. She stood up, wobbling slightly. "You have to stay quiet. If they find me, they'll kill us both." John swallowed hard. He didn't know who they were, but the fear in Lyra's voice was real. He grabbed a wrench from his workbench. He wasn't sure what good it would do, but it made him feel a little less helpless. Lyra moved to the corner of the room, clutching a small pendant around her neck. John noticed it was glowing faintly, just like the symbols on her arms. "What is that?" he whispered. "It's my only chance," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. "But it's too risky to use it now." The humming grew louder, and a faint tapping sound came from the window. John's heart pounded as he motioned for Lyra to stay still. Slowly, he crept toward the window, peeking out from the edge of the curtain. What he saw made his blood run cold. Outside, in the shadows, were tall, humanoid figures. They moved unnaturally, their limbs too long and their eyes glowing a harsh, piercing blue. They scanned the area with small devices, their movements precise and mechanical. John stepped back, his mind racing. "What are they?" he whispered. "Not human," Lyra replied. "They're hunters, and they won't stop until they find me." John's grip tightened on the wrench. He didn't know what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be an ordinary night. The secret revealed. The next morning, John woke up to find Lyra pacing nervously around the workshop. She looked different in the light. Her shimmering skin seemed almost translucent, and her silvery hair caught the sunlight in an unnatural way. She had a certain presence, something regal, yet fragile. John rubbed his eyes and sat up on the old couch he had crashed on. "All right, Lyra. I think I deserve some answers now. Who were those things outside last night? And why are they after you?" Lyra stopped pacing and looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. She hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "You're right. You deserve to know. But it's not something you're going to believe easily." John raised an eyebrow. "After last night, I'm ready to believe just about anything." Lyra nodded and sat down across from him. She held out her hands, palms up, and suddenly, the strange symbols on her arms began to glow again. The light pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. As John stared, the air between her hands shimmered, and a holographic image appeared. A vast alien city floating above a lush green planet. It was like something out of a dream. "This is my home," she said softly. Or, it was. John leaned forward, his jaw dropping. "What is this? A trick? Some kind of advanced tech?" "It's not a trick," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "I'm not from your world. I'm from a planet called Aloria. It was a beautiful place, full of life and light. My people were different. We were connected to our planet, to its energy. That's what you see on my skin. Aloria's energy still flows through me." John blinked, struggling to process what he was hearing. "All right, let's say I believe you. What happened to your planet?" Lyra's expression darkened. The hologram shifted, showing massive ships descending on the floating city. Explosions rocked the image as the city fell from the sky, and the lush green planet turned gray and barren. "They came," she said, her voice trembling. "The Clyrans. They're conquerors, destroyers. They wanted our energy, our knowledge. My people fought back, but we couldn't stop them. They destroyed Aloria and scattered the survivors across the galaxy." John stared at the hologram, the weight of her words sinking in. "And you? How did you end up here?" Lyra looked down at the pendant around her neck, clutching it tightly. I was the princess of Aloria. My parents sent me away on a small ship during the attack. They hoped I could survive, maybe even find help. I've been running ever since." John exhaled slowly, trying to process everything. "So those things outside last night, they're the Clyrans." Lyra nodded. "They've been hunting me for years. If they catch me, they'll extract everything I know. About Aloria, about our energy. They'll use it to fuel their empire and destroy more worlds, including yours." The weight of her words hit John like a truck. He stood up, pacing the room. "And you came here, to Earth. What made you think this place was safe?" "I didn't know it was safe," Lyra admitted, "but I had no choice. My ship was damaged, and I barely made it through your planet's atmosphere. I landed far from here and have been moving ever since." John stopped pacing and turned to her. "You're telling me Earth is now on their radar because of you?" Lyra flinched at his tone, but nodded. "Yes. I'm sorry, John. I never wanted to put anyone in danger. But if I stay hidden, Maybe they'll leave once they realize I'm not here. John ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. What happens if they catch you? Lyra's glowing eyes met his. If they catch me, they'll destroy me. And then they'll destroy Earth. John felt his stomach drop. He didn't know much about aliens or galactic wars, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just throw her out and hope for the best. All right, he said finally. You can stay here. But if we're doing this, we're going to need a plan. Lyra looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. You're willing to help me? John shrugged, trying to hide the nervousness he felt. Well, I can't exactly let them destroy my planet, can I? Besides, I've always been a sucker for lost causes. A small smile touched Lyra's lips, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. Thank you, John. You don't know how much this means to me. Before John could respond, a loud hum filled the air, louder than the night before. He rushed to the window and froze. In the sky above the town, faint blue lights flickered in a grid-like pattern. The Clyrans were searching. They're here, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. And they're getting closer. John turned to her, his resolve hardening. Then we better get to work. The first encounter. The air in Willow Creek crackled with an eerie tension. It was late evening, and the small town had an unnatural stillness about it. John stood outside his workshop, his eyes scanning the horizon. Lyra had insisted they stay hidden, but something told him they couldn't run forever. He tightened his grip on a makeshift weapon, a steel pipe wrapped in duct tape, and turned to Lyra, who was crouched by the window inside. They're out there, aren't they? John asked, his voice low. Lyra nodded, her glowing eyes catching the dim light. They've begun the sweep. The Clyrans won't stop until they're certain I'm not here. John frowned. And if they find you? She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. If they find me, they'll extract everything I know about my people and their technology. Then they'll destroy this place, just like they did my world. John clenched his jaw, his mind racing. We need to fight back. We can't just wait for them to find us. Lyra shook her head. You don't understand. The Clyrans are relentless. They're not like you, human. They don't hesitate, they don't tire, and they don't show mercy. Before John could respond, a low humming sound filled the air. It wasn't the sound of any machine he knew. It was alien, otherworldly. Lyra's expression changed instantly, her calm demeanor giving way to raw fear. They're here, she whispered. John peered through a crack in the workshop door. A strange, disc-shaped drone hovered a few feet above the ground, scanning the area with a beam of pale blue light. It moved methodically, its glowing sensors sweeping over every corner of the yard. What is that? John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A seeker drone, Lyra replied, her hands trembling. It's designed to locate energy signatures, specifically mine. John's heart pounded. How do we stop it? Lyra hesitated, then reached for the pendant around her neck. She pressed a small, hidden button, and the pendant began to emit a faint, pulsating glow. I can disrupt its signal for a few seconds, but we need to act fast. Once it's disabled, they'll know something is wrong. Good enough for me, John said, gripping the steel pipe tighter. Tell me when. The drone hovered closer, its scanning beam inches from the workshop door. John could hear its faint mechanical whirring, like a predator stalking its prey. Lyra took a deep breath and activated the pendant. A sharp, high-pitched sound filled the air, and the drone froze mid-air, its lights flickering. Now, Lyra shouted. John didn't hesitate. He burst through the door, swinging the steel pipe with all his strength. The blow landed with a loud clang, and the drone spiraled out of control, crashing into the ground. Sparks flew as it emitted a series of garbled electronic sounds before going silent. Breathing heavily, John turned back to Lyra, who had stepped outside. Is it done? He asked. She shook her head. They know. The disruption wasn't long enough to hide us. They'll be here soon. As if on cue, the sky above them lit up with faint blue streaks. John's stomach twisted as he realized what was happening. More drones were descending, their lights moving in precise formations. "We need to move," Lyra said, urgency in her voice. "They'll send ground units next. We can't be here when they arrive." John grabbed a bag of tools and whatever supplies he could find. "Where do we go? They'll follow us no matter where we hide." Lyra hesitated, then looked toward the woods. "There's an old cave system nearby. If we can reach it, I can use the natural minerals to mask my energy signature." John nodded, not fully understanding but trusting her judgment. Together, they darted into the woods, the sounds of approaching drones growing louder behind them. As they ran, John couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Clyrans weren't just after Lyra. They were sending a message. And if they didn't find her, they'd tear apart everything in their path. For the first time in years, John felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Fear. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unshakable determination to protect the strange, glowing woman running beside him. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going to let her face it alone. The betrayal. The old cave was damp and cold, but it offered a temporary refuge. John sat on a jagged rock, wiping sweat from his brow, while Lyra examined the faintly glowing lines on her arms. Her pendant flickered intermittently, a sign that its energy was nearly depleted. "We can't keep running like this," John muttered, his voice echoing in the cavern. "We need a real plan." Lyra didn't look up. A real plan takes time, and time is the one thing we don't have. Before John could respond, a faint vibration ran through the ground. He froze, exchanging a worried glance with Lyra. "What was that?" he asked. Lyra's glowing eyes narrowed. "They're scanning. The Clyrans use seismic pulses to map underground spaces. They'll know we're here soon if we don't move deeper into the caves." John cursed under his breath and grabbed the bag of supplies they had hastily packed. "Let's go." As they ventured further into the cave, the air grew colder and the passageways narrower. Lyra suddenly stopped, her head tilting as if she were listening to something. "What is it?" John whispered. "Someone's nearby," she said, her voice tense. "But it doesn't feel like a Clyran." John raised an eyebrow. "A human. Out here." Before Lyra could answer, a flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead. A familiar voice called out, "John, is that you?" It was Paul, John's neighbor and the town's nosiest busybody. Relief flooded John's face for a moment, but Lyra's reaction was immediate. She stepped back, her glowing arms dimming as if she were trying to hide herself. "What the hell are you doing out here, Paul?" John asked, keeping his voice steady. Paul's figure came into view, his face a mixture of relief and suspicion. "I should be asking you the same thing. The whole town's talking about strange lights in the sky and military-looking folks poking around. Figured you might know something." John forced a laugh. "Just out for a hike. Needed some air." Paul's eyes darted to Lyra, narrowing as he noticed her odd appearance. "Who's your friend? Don't think I've seen her around before." "She's just passing through," John said quickly, trying to deflect. "Had a rough night." Paul didn't look convinced. "That's so. Funny thing, I saw some of those military folks heading toward your workshop earlier. Said they were looking for someone dangerous." Lyra stiffened, and John felt his stomach drop. "And what did you tell them?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. Paul hesitated, his gaze flicking between John and Lyra. "I told them I saw someone fitting her description. Figured it'd keep him off my back." The air grew thick with tension. John took a step closer to Paul, his fists clenching. "You did what?" Paul raised his hands defensively. "Hey, don't look at me like that. They were gonna search the whole town anyway. I just gave them a head start." "You don't understand what you've done," Lyra said, her voice trembling with anger. The glowing lines on her arms flared, illuminating the cavern in an otherworldly light. Paul stumbled back, his face pale. What the hell is she? She's the reason those people are here, John snapped. And if they find her, they'll destroy everything, including you. Paul opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, the cave shook violently. Rocks tumbled from the ceiling, and a deafening hum filled the air. Lyra's glow dimmed as her energy faltered. They're here, she whispered. John grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her deeper into the cave. Run, he shouted over the noise. Paul hesitated for a moment before following, his flashlight bobbing wildly. The three of them sprinted through the winding tunnels, the hum growing louder behind them. A sudden burst of blue light filled the passage, and John risked a glance back. A group of Clyran soldiers, their sleek, metallic armor glinting in the glow, was advancing rapidly. We can't outrun them, Lyra said, her voice tight with desperation. I need to use the pendant. You said it's too risky, John shouted. Do you have a better idea? She snapped, stopping abruptly and clutching the glowing pendant. The cave walls seemed to pulse in response, the air crackling with energy. Paul stumbled to a halt, his eyes wide with fear. What is she doing? Saving our lives, John replied grimly. Lyra pressed the pendant to the ground, and a shockwave of light rippled outward. The Clyran soldiers froze mid-step, their forms flickering like broken holograms. For a brief moment, the cave was silent. But the pendant shattered in Lyra's hands, its energy spent. She swayed on her feet, and John caught her before she collapsed. That'll only slow them down, she whispered weakly. We need to keep moving. John glanced at Paul, who looked like he was about to bolt. You wanted to know what's going on. Now you're part of it. Stay close and don't do anything stupid. Paul nodded shakily, and the three of them disappeared deeper into the cave, the sound of the Clyrans stirring behind them. The chase. The forest was alive with sounds. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, and the distant hum of alien machinery. John's lungs burned as he ran, his boots slipping on the damp underbrush. Lyra was just ahead, her silver hair catching the faint moonlight like a beacon. Behind them, Paul stumbled, his flashlight swaying wildly in his hand. Keep moving, John barked, glancing back. He could see faint blue lights cutting through the darkness. Clyran hunters were closing in fast. They're too close. Lyra gasped, her voice trembling. Her glow was fading, a sign that her energy reserves were nearly gone. We need to slow them down. John scanned the terrain, his mind racing. They were deep in the woods, far from the cave, and the Clyrans had the advantage of speed and precision. Then he spotted it, a fallen tree, massive and rotted, precariously balanced on a slope. Help me with this, he shouted, skidding to a stop beside the trunk. Paul doubled over, gasping for air. Are you insane? We can't stop here. Do you have a better idea? John snapped, already shoving his shoulder against the tree. Lyra, give me a hand. Lyra hesitated for only a second before joining him. Her hands glowed faintly as she pushed, and the tree groaned under the strain. With a final heave, the trunk rolled free, crashing down the slope and into the path of their pursuers. The sound was deafening, and for a moment, the forest was still. John turned to Lyra. That'll buy us some time. Let's go. But the respite was short-lived. The hum of Clyran drones echoed through the trees, growing louder by the second. Lyra grabbed John's arm, her eyes wide. They've sent aerial units. We won't make it out of here unless we find cover. Cover where? Paul shouted, panic rising in his voice. We're in the middle of nowhere. Lyra's glowing eyes darted around, and then she pointed to a cluster of boulders partially obscured by thick vines. There, the rocks might block their scans. The three of them dove behind the boulders just as a sleek metallic drone zipped overhead. Its bright blue searchlight swept the forest floor, pausing briefly near the fallen tree before moving on. John held his breath, his grip tightening on the wrench he had taken from the workshop. What are they looking for? Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. Me, Lyra replied, her voice laced with guilt. The energy signature in my body. It's how they track me. Paul stared at her, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. Then why are we running? Let them take you. Maybe they'll leave the rest of us alone. That's not how they work, John growled, stepping between Paul and Lyra. If they get her, they'll rip everything they can from her. And then they'll come for us. For all of us. Before Paul could respond, the ground shook violently. A nearby tree split in half, its trunk glowing with an unnatural blue light. The Clyrans were using some kind of energy weapon to clear the area. The noise was deafening, and John felt the vibration in his chest. Lyra's eyes narrowed. We can't stay here. They'll find us eventually. John nodded, gripping his wrench tightly. All right, what's the plan? Lyra hesitated, then reached for a small cylindrical device tucked into the folds of her strange, tattered clothing. She handed it to John. This is a disruptor. It'll disable their tech for a few minutes, but it has to be close to work. John examined the device, its smooth surface cold against his skin. How close are we talking? Close enough to be dangerous, Lyra admitted. If you can get it into the middle of their search grid, we might have a chance to escape. John stared at her, then at the glowing lights moving closer through the trees. All right, he said, his voice steady. I'll do it. Are you insane? Paul hissed. You'll get yourself killed. John turned to him, his expression hard. If we don't do this, we're all dead. You want to survive. Then stay here and keep quiet. Lyra stepped closer to John, her glowing hand brushing his arm. Be careful, she said softly. He nodded, then slipped into the shadows, the disruptor clutched tightly in his hand. The forest seemed to close in around him as he moved, the hum of the Clyrans growing louder with every step. The blue lights danced between the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed alive. John's heart pounded as he crept closer to the center of the grid. He could see them now, tall, sleek figures in metallic armor, their glowing eyes scanning the forest with cold precision. He ducked behind a tree, holding his breath as one of them passed mere feet away. This is crazy, he muttered to himself, his fingers tightening around the disruptor. Finally, he reached the center of the grid. The Clyrans had set up a small device, a glowing, pulsating sphere that seemed to be coordinating the search. John knew this was his chance. He activated the disruptor, its surface lighting up with a soft hum, and hurled it toward the sphere. The moment it landed, a shockwave of energy rippled outward. The Clyrans froze, their bodies flickering like holograms, and the drones crashed to the ground. John didn't wait to see the aftermath. He turned and sprinted back toward the boulders, his lungs burning and his heart racing. Lyra and Paul were waiting, their faces filled with relief as he appeared. It worked, John panted. But we need to move before they recover. Lyra nodded, her glow returning faintly. You bought us time. Let's use it. As they disappeared deeper into the forest, John couldn't shake the feeling that the Clyrans were far from finished, and that the worst was yet to come. The final stand. The abandoned power station loomed ahead, its rusted towers and shattered windows standing like sentinels against the darkening sky. John led the way, his boots crunching on the gravel-strewn ground. Behind him, Lyra walked with a determined stride, her glow faint but steady. Paul followed reluctantly, muttering under his breath about how they were all going to die. This place doesn't look like much, John said, scanning their surroundings. Are you sure it'll work? It has to, Lyra replied, her voice firm. She stopped and placed her glowing hand against the wall of the power station. The symbols on her arms pulsed faintly, and the air seemed to shimmer around her. The old power grid here uses minerals that can amplify energy. If I can channel it, we might stand a chance. Paul scoffed, kicking a loose rock. Might. That's comforting. John shot him a glare. You're free to leave, Paul. No one's stopping you. Paul opened his mouth to retort, but froze when a faint hum filled the air. It was low at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew steadily louder. Lyra's head snapped up, her glowing eyes narrowing. "They're here," she said. John turned to her. "How long do you need?" 5 minutes, she replied, already moving toward the center of the station. "Maybe less if the grid still holds some residual energy." "We don't have 5 minutes," Paul said, his voice rising with panic. "They're going to kill us." John grabbed Paul's arm, his grip firm. "You want to live. Then help me slow them down. Lyra needs time." Paul hesitated, fear etched across his face, but a sharp look from John silenced his protests. He nodded reluctantly and followed John toward the entrance. The first wave came quickly, 2 drones zipping through the shattered windows, their blue searchlights cutting through the gloom. John swung his wrench, smashing one to the ground in a shower of sparks. Paul screamed as the second drone fired a bright, searing beam that narrowly missed him. "Focus, Paul," John shouted, tossing him a crowbar. "You're not useless. Prove it." Paul's hands trembled, but he gripped the crowbar tightly. When the drone turned toward him, he swung with all his strength, knocking it into a rusted beam where it exploded in a bright flash. "I did it," Paul said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Good," John said. "Now keep doing it." Outside, the hum grew louder. Shadows moved in the distance, sleek and predatory. The Clyrans were coming. Lyra knelt in the center of the power station, her pendant glowing brightly as she worked. She whispered words in her alien tongue, her hands moving in intricate patterns. The old power grid began to hum to life, the faint flicker of lights illuminating the room. Sweat beaded on her brow as she poured her energy into the system. Come on," she muttered, her voice strained. The Clyrans breached the station a moment later, their metallic forms shimmering with unnatural light. They moved with precision, their glowing eyes locking onto John and Paul. "Here we go," John muttered, gripping his wrench like a lifeline. The first Clyran lunged, its elongated limbs slicing through the air. John dodged, rolling to the side, and swung the wrench into its head. The impact caused a spark, but the creature barely flinched. It turned to him, its movements unnervingly fluid, and struck out with a blade-like arm. John ducked, narrowly avoiding the blow. "These things don't go down easy," he shouted. Paul, meanwhile, was cornered by another Clyran. His crowbar felt laughably small against the towering figure. He swung wildly, managing to knock the weapon out of its hand, but the Clyran grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off the ground. Paul gasped, clawing at its hand. "Over here, tin can," John yelled, throwing a loose piece of metal at the Clyran. It turned, releasing Paul, and advanced toward John instead. "Any time now, Lyra," John called out, his voice strained as he dodged another attack. Lyra's hands glowed brighter, and the symbols on her arms pulsed in rhythm with the power grid. The hum reached a crescendo, and the entire station seemed to vibrate. Her eyes snapped open, blazing with light. "It's ready," she shouted. John stumbled back, narrowly avoiding another strike. "What do we do?" "Get down," Lyra screamed. John tackled Paul to the ground as a massive pulse of energy erupted from Lyra's pendant. The light was blinding, and a deafening roar filled the air. The Clyrans froze, their bodies flickering and distorting before collapsing into heaps of smoking metal. The drones outside crashed to the ground, their lights extinguished. When the light faded, John sat up, his ears ringing. The power station was eerily silent. He turned to Lyra, who was slumped on the ground, her glow nearly gone. "Lyra," he shouted, rushing to her side. She opened her eyes weakly, a faint smile on her lips. "It worked," she whispered, "but it's not over yet." The silence was shattered by a distant roar, a sound deeper and more menacing than before. John looked toward the horizon, his heart sinking as a massive Clyran ship descended, its lights illuminating the forest. "Round 2, he muttered, helping Lyra to her feet. "What now?" Lyra's eyes flickered, determination shining through her exhaustion. Now we finish this. Victory and goodbye. The Clyran mothership loomed overhead, its massive, shadowy form blotting out the stars. Its glowing blue lights pulsed rhythmically, casting an eerie glow over the ravaged forest. John stood beside Lyra, her frail form barely upright, her glow flickering like a dying ember. Paul lingered a few feet away, clutching a crowbar and muttering curses under his breath. "They're deploying more troops," Lyra said, her voice weak but resolute, her glowing eyes fixed on the enormous ship. "We have one chance to stop them." John glanced at the broken ruins of the power station behind them. "We barely survived the last wave. Lyra, how are we supposed to take down that?" He gestured to the ship, its underbelly bristling with alien weaponry. Lyra held up the shattered remains of her pendant. "The pulse I created was just the beginning. The energy grid here is still active. If I connect to it one last time, I can overload the ship's systems." John's heart sank. "And what happens to you if you do that?" Lyra met his gaze, the answer clear in her solemn expression. "No," John said firmly. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Lyra said softly. "The Clyrans won't stop until I'm gone, John. You know that." "Then let's make them stop without you sacrificing yourself," he insisted. "We're in this together." Paul, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "She's right, John. Look around. We're outmatched, outnumbered, and out of time. If this is the only way, we have to let her do it." John turned to Paul, his frustration boiling over. "You don't get to decide that. She's not some tool for us to use." Lyra stepped forward, placing a glowing hand on John's shoulder. "It's okay," she said gently. "This is my fight, and it's my choice. You've done more for me than I ever could have asked. Now I need you to trust me." John clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I trust you." The Clyran soldiers began descending from the ship in sleek, metallic pods. The ground trembled as they landed, their forms emerging from the mist like spectral figures. Lyra turned to John and Paul. "Hold them off for as long as you can. I'll need time to activate the grid." John grabbed his wrench, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. "You focus on the grid. We'll handle the rest." Paul gave a shaky nod, his grip tightening on the crowbar. "Let's make this count." The battle was chaos. The Clyran soldiers moved with unnerving precision, their glowing weapons slicing through the air. John and Paul fought desperately, using every ounce of their strength and wit to hold the line. John's makeshift traps, sharpened stakes, tripwires, and oil-soaked rags slowed the enemy down, but not enough. "How much longer, Lyra?" John shouted, ducking under a blade-like arm and slamming his wrench into a soldier's head. "Almost there," Lyra called from inside the power station, her voice strained. The grid was crackling with energy, the air around her shimmering with light. Paul screamed as a Clyran soldier tackled him, pinning him to the ground. John lunged forward, knocking the creature off him with a brutal swing of his wrench. "Stay on your feet, Paul," he barked. "I'm trying," Paul yelled, scrambling to his feet. Inside the station, Lyra's body was surrounded by a blinding glow. The symbols on her arms burned brightly as she poured the last of her energy into the grid. The old equipment groaned under the strain, sparks flying from the panels. "Just a little more," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. The Clyran mothership began to flicker, its blue lights dimming. The soldiers on the ground froze momentarily, their movements stuttering like a corrupted program. Outside, John noticed the change. "Lyra's doing it," he shouted, hope surging through him. But then, a deafening roar shook the earth. The mothership's weapons began to charge, targeting the power station. Lyra's eyes widened as the massive cannon aimed directly at her. John sprinted toward the station, his heart pounding. "Lyra," he yelled. She turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sorrow. "It's done, John. Get out of here." "No," he shouted, skidding to a halt outside the station. "I'm not leaving you." The cannon fired, and in that instant, Lyra unleashed the full force of the grid's energy. A massive pulse erupted from the station, engulfing the area in a blinding light. The Clyron mothership shuddered, its lights extinguishing one by one, before it exploded in a brilliant cascade of debris. When the light faded, the forest was silent. The Clyrons were gone, their soldiers reduced to smoldering wreckage. John stumbled to his feet, his vision blurry. "Lyra," he called out, his voice breaking. Inside the station, there was no sign of her. The grid was dark, and the pendant lay shattered on the ground. John fell to his knees, the weight of her sacrifice crushing him. Paul approached slowly, his face pale. She did it." John clenched his fists, his chest heaving. "She saved us." Weeks later, John stood in the ruins of the power station, gazing up at the stars. He held a small fragment of Lyra's pendant, its glow faint but steady. "You said you'd come back," he whispered. "And I'll be here, waiting." As he turned to leave, a faint shimmer crossed the sky. A shooting star, or perhaps something more. John smiled, his heart heavy but filled with hope. "Goodbye, Lyra. For now."